Colonization of the New World paralleled reform movements in Europe. Religious reform contributes to the race to establish new settlements in the New World. Samuel Purchas, an English cleric living during the height of reform, said, "Isn't it interesting that the New World was discovered about the time the Protestant Reformation began?" Purchas believed God kept America hidden until Protestants could convert it. Englishmen owed it to God, he said, to do what God had laid out for them to do. While European ships plied the Atlantic in search of new lands to explore, conquer, and exploit, the Church tried to find some measure of peace, a peace which took years to develop. In spite of the Peace of Augsburg, Protestants and Catholics on the continent experienced little peace. Armed conflict between Protestants and Catholics continued unabated through Europe for about 30 years. Open warfare exploded in Bohemia after 1618, when Bohemians rebelled and Catholic troops suppressed rebellion there, as well as in lands where the rebels had allies. Scandinavian Lutherans intervened in the defense of Protestants. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden invaded Germany, winning significant battles until he himself was killed in one of those battles. The 30 Years' War ended in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, which guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics, Lutherans, and Reformed Christians. In France, however, the peace guaranteed in 1648 didn't last. As I mentioned in the last lecture, French Huguenots possessed 10 cities. The government had given them 10 cities to occupy and defend. But Cardinal Richelieu, acting for King Louis XIII, refused to tolerate the existence of Protestants in France. French forces defeated the Protestants, and that led to their expulsion in 1685. Protestants continued to exist in France underground, however, and later reemerged even stronger. Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch, died in 1603 without heir. James VI of Scotland, the nearest relative, became James I of England. A stubbornly vain leader, James claimed to rule by divine right. English citizens protested his heavy-handed rule with little effect. Without any appeal to Parliament, James levied direct taxes upon property and trade. The greatest dissatisfaction arose, however, over his religious policies. As a Catholic in a Protestant country, James promoted toleration for Catholics. But at the same time, he tried to soften his ruling with ordering a new Bible translation, which we now know as the King James Version. James died in 1625, and his son Charles I came to the throne. Charles viewed royal power just like James I. He decided to rule without Parliament, and he succeeded until he was forced to call Parliament together for the approval to raise taxes. Parliament refused, with Protestants offering the most resistance. Frustrated, Charles ordered the Parliament dissolved, but the body refused to disband. Parliament then called the Assembly of Westminster, whose confession in 1647 became the standard for Calvinist orthodoxy. Further conflict between king and Parliament led to civil war. Parliamentary forces defeated Charles I. He was then tried and executed in 1649. With Charles out of the way, Oliver Cromwell became Lord Protector, and he ruled England under a document called the Instrument of Government, which was a constitution of sorts. England became a republic, although Cromwell wielded dictatorial power. Throughout the reigns of James and Charles, there were several more radical Protestant groups that began to form. Chief among them were the Puritans and Independents. Puritans insisted the English Church needed further purification through the removal of all of the vestiges of Catholicism and anything they considered unscriptural. Puritans were extremely Calvinistic in their theology and resisted every effort the Crown undertook to force their conformity to the liturgy and form of the English Church. Independents called for a congregational form of church government, thus eliminating the Church of England's ecclesiastical structure. Other smaller and more radical groups also began to appear. Levelers and true levelers were radical Puritans who believed God wanted all men leveled into a classless society. Nobility, bourgeoisie, and the lower classes would all disappear into simply one society without any class distinction. The Diggers were a splinter faction of the Levelers who attempted to establish communities in England's wastelands, lands that had been farmed almost to the point where they wouldn't raise anything else. And the Diggers wanted to go out into those lands and reclaim the land and then establish communities where all men would be totally equal. The Ranters were extremists of the worst sort. Ranters denied Christ's existence. Others within the group claimed to be Christ. Ranters believed Christ came in the Spirit, making anything mundane like preaching or communion or Bible study. All of those things became unnecessary. Seekers gave up on ever finding the true church, and believing the world would soon end, they simply withdrew from society. A group called the Grindletonians were believers from a community in Yorkshire who emphasized the Spirit over Scripture. All of these groups that I've mentioned shared common political objectives. They wanted the abolition of tithes, the abolition of a state church, the institution of legal and educational reforms, and the destruction of the English class system. After Cromwell's death, his son Richard followed him, but all the religious and political unrest made his work impossible. So Parliament ultimately decided to restore the monarchy in the person of Charles II. But unrest continued throughout his reign and that of his successor, James II. Ultimately, Parliament called William of Orange and his wife Mary to succeed James II in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. William instituted a tolerant religious policy, allowing latitude in belief and practice as long as the Church itself adhered to the 39 Articles in England and the Westminster Confession of Faith in Scotland. Puritans began to leave England for Holland during the reign of James I. These were the separatist Puritans. These Puritans were one of two varieties. Separatist Puritans considered every congregation a distinct unity, independent of all outside control. They rejected synods, presbyteries, and the English church and its ecclesiastical structure. Churches accountable to such sources, they said, were considered anything but true churches. Separatists withdrew and rejected both the English church and the king's intrusion into congregational life. For them, the best way to purify the church was to withdraw in protest and work outside the existing churches to bring further reform. Non-separatist Puritans agreed with the separatists on most issues, especially those on restricting church membership to what they called proven saints. A proven saint is one who professes a verifiable conversion experience and who lives a separated life. They did not, however, condemn the Church of England or the king and believed they should remain in the Church of England and work from within to bring about reform. Principles of Puritanism, true to both the separatists and the non-separatists, included the following. In their view, 1, the visible church is a particular local congregation. It's a locally autonomous body, self-ruled, self-governed, self-sustained. It is never an organization or anybody outside the local church. 2, the church is formally gathered or voluntarily assembled and agrees to covenants binding members together. So a congregation would come together voluntarily, not because it was assigned by a bishop to a particular region or area. And the members then would covenant together to fulfill certain responsibilities and to keep certain restrictions and rules. And thus they would be bound together as one body, one church. Third, the true church is composed of holy or regenerate members. And these were individuals who had a conversion experience and were living a holy lifestyle. And the church exercised strict discipline in its practice. And then fourth, Jesus is the only head of the church, not the king, nor the Archbishop of Canterbury. Only Jesus is the head of the church. Now, on the continent, Lutherans, Catholics, and Reformed churches were struggling to preserve rigid orthodoxy. Each church experienced numerous internal debates and struggles. The Lutheran Church experienced these troubles, the Catholic Church experienced them as well, as we've talked about, and the Reformed churches also. Catholic debates had to do with the authority of the Pope, and those who argued on this basis were those we would label Gallicanism or Febronianism or Josephism. Catholics also argued about the relationship between grace and human participation in salvation. And groups that were involved in this kind of argument were the Jansenists and those who practiced quietism. Let me talk a minute about each of those. Gallicanism was the insistence by the French Church that it preserve certain liberties which long applied to the French Church. French clerics struggled against the papacy to maintain these rights, and they became simply identified as the Gallicans, simply due to the ancient name of that region, which was Gaul. Febronianism was named for Justin Febronius, and held that the church is the community of the faith. The bishops are their representatives, and the episcopacy as a whole, not merely the Bishop of Rome, should rule the church. It's almost like the conciliar movement. The Febronius believed that it was the church as the members, all of them members together, who comprised the church, and that the bishops were simply their representatives, and thus all of the episcopacy, whether a bishop or an archbishop or a cardinal bishop or whomever, or even the Pope, should rule the church. They should do it together. Josephism was the term given to the attempt by Emperor Joseph II, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, to govern and reform the church within his territories without the Pope's guidelines or those of the Council of Trent. Jansenism, which became the most powerful of all of these movements, attempted to revive Augustine's most radical doctrines of grace and predestination. Catholic hierarchy condemned Jansenism, but it continued unabated, particularly within the Jesuit. Quietism advocated total passivity before God as the best means of devotion. Protestants held to their own version of quietism. That became known as pietism. There were also controversies among Lutherans, particularly the followers of Melanchthon and strict Lutherans. Lutheran scholars such as George Calixtus tried to define every doctrinal detail and deviation. One of the groups insisted nothing should be required of Christians that was not believed in the first 5 centuries of the church's existence. By going back to these early centuries, they thought, Lutherans believed they could avoid unnecessary controversy. Now, this sounds a lot like the leaders in the early Restoration movement of the 1800s. Alexander Campbell, for example, insisted the church should recapture the faith and practice of the New Testament church. He didn't go so far as to include the first 5 centuries, but he did point back to the New Testament church of the first century. Reformed Orthodoxy centered its attention on predestination and grace, the 2 major focuses of the Synod of Dort and the Westminster Assembly. As you have seen, Dort condemned Jacob Arminius and Arminianism, which Reformed clergy believed gave too much active participation to the believer for salvation. Now, if you've gone over my essay on the essence of Calvinism, you have a better understanding why the Reformed Church strongly opposed Arminianism. Rationalism, which was a reaction to pietism and quietism and all of these spiritualist concepts that you heard about through what we've talked about already. Rationalism began with the work of René Descartes. On the European continent, Spinoza and Leibniz carried the movement forward. But John Locke was the greatest contributor to the development of what came to be known in Germany as the Aufklärung, or the Enlightenment. The thought of the Enlightenment represents a new way of looking at the world. Emphasizing human ability and reason, it de-emphasized revelation as a way of knowing and replaced it with reason, human rationalism. Enlightenment thought drew heavily from Aristotle's empiricism. As a result, shifts in perspective occurred in three different realms. First, a shift occurred in the realm of authority. Prior to the Enlightenment, two traditional authority sources existed, and they were the Bible and the classics. Both sources came under attack. Science and discoveries in the natural world raised questions not easily dismissed by appeal to Scripture or the ancient philosophers. Copernicus, for example, discovered the Earth's rotation, and Galileo discovered the Earth's path around the sun. All at once, the Earth seemed insignificant and a mere speck in a huge universe. Discoveries in geology suggested mankind lived on a much older planet than the 5,704 years Bishop Ussher suggested. Although most Enlightenment philosophers remained Christians, their view of Christianity became a form of deism. Western humanity found itself adrift, looking in vain for the authority of some kind of absolutes. One source seemed obvious, and that was the individual himself. Second, a shift occurred in the realm of epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophical study of how we know what we know. Prior to the Enlightenment, the concept of innate ideas was basic. Even Descartes believed the mind held all knowledge. Education, then, was the means to draw it out. Enlightenment thinkers, however, came to believe the mind was a tabula rasa, a blank slate, upon which sensory data is then written. Human beings only know through observation, experimentation, and evaluation. Anything not verifiable by the senses is unknowable, they said. If all knowledge derives from sense perception, what happens to the concept of God? God cannot be scientifically verified. Scriptures don't prove God's existence, since its data cannot be subjected to investigation, or at least it was thought to be so. Third, a shift also occurred in the understanding of anthropology. Reason required a new look at humanity. Pessimism reigned prior to the Enlightenment. Scripture defines each person as sinful. Catholics and all reformers taught Adam's sin left human beings spiritually deformed and depraved. The Enlightenment, however, rejected this pessimistic view. They believed human beings can reason and can apply reason to any problem. The philosopher Leibniz said, "This world is the best of all possible worlds." Environment shapes a person, but individuals can change the environment and improve. So began the cult of progress. So we have a transition in authority from outside to inside. We have a transition in epistemology, in the way we know things, from revelation and from pulling what's known out of the mind by education, or simply feeding into the mind sensory data from outside. And we see a shift in anthropology, the look at human beings as capable of understanding and hearing and believing. Toward the end of the Enlightenment period, thinkers such as David Hume and Immanuel Kant began to think reason was not nearly as objective as previously thought. For these thinkers, religious truth rests within. Kant insists man's moral sense becomes his source of religious knowledge. So issues of faith are moving from the outside, from the objective, from the concept of objective truth of Scripture to the subjective feeling of each individual. A consequence of the Enlightenment was the emergence of a series of positions which underscored the importance of experience and obedience over orthodoxy. Pietism, and I've talked a little bit about that, pietism, a passive submission to God based on internal experience, brought with it a renewal of spiritual response to God. Among the Lutherans, Philip Jacob Spener and August Hermann Francke called for an awakening built around small groups and an emphasis on spiritual discipline. The movement attacked Orthodox Lutherans, thinking them cold and impassionate. Lutherans were not engaged in missionary enterprise, but the Lutheran pietists turned that around, insisting on Christian responsibility and vocation so often missed by those considered mainstream. Another group, the Moravians, a descendant of the Bohemian Hussite movement, became known for their devotional life and missionary zeal. Their worship emphasized the sensuality of the descriptions of Christ's death on the cross and the emotion which emerged from such contemplation. John and Charles Wesley founded Methodism to restore evangelism and spirituality to the Church of England. After laboring for years as a missionary in Europe and America, John Wesley reported an experience at Aldersgate Chapel which convinced him of his salvation. Wesley, while at Oxford, developed what he called a holy club to promote spirituality and a deep personal faith. He encouraged spiritual depth in small groups or classes, which provided time for introspection, for confession, and mutual encouragement. His movement eventually broke away from the Church of England to become the Methodist Episcopal Church. Methodism came to America as part of the Church of England, but grew rapidly when separation took place after the Civil War. George Fox taught inner light, which he set against the authority of the church. His followers became known as Quakers. William Penn is one of the more famous of the Quakers. There were others who emphasized the spiritual life as well, but many of them were not nearly as faithful to biblical Christianity as those I've mentioned. Well, all during this time, colonization is taking place, and I need to talk a little bit about that. Christopher Columbus discovered the continents on the Western Hemisphere in 1492, although he did not understand what he had found. Columbus sailed to America at least 4 times. Each time he returned to Europe confused with what he had found. At least the Norsemen who came west much earlier established a few short-lived settlements before returning home. Amerigo Vespucci, for whom western continents are named, ended his voyages as confused as Columbus. Peter Martyr, a German monk, examined the records of these voyages and concluded there must be a major landmass or landmasses between Europe and Asia. He published his theory in 1507, and in a sense, Peter Martyr is the discoverer of America. Columbus sailed 25 years before Luther nailed his challenges for debate to the door of the Wittenberg Chapel. Peter Martyr published his theory 10 years before Luther raised his challenge. Once the Reformation was well underway, settlement began in earnest in the Western Hemisphere. Spain began North American exploration and settlement in the early 1500s. Spanish missions were planted on the southern California coast and throughout Mexico. Spanish explorers traveled inland as far as what is now Kansas, searching for the mythical kingdom of Quivira and its cities of gold. Ponce de Leon explored what is now Florida. The Spanish built a fort near what is now St. Augustine in 1695. Most of us have some familiarity with the exploits of the Spanish conquistadors and their search for gold. We know the story of the defeat of the Aztecs in Mexico and the defeat of the Incas in what is now Peru. Little information is given to us about the French, but we do know French settlers established a colony at Guanabara Bay in 1555. Guanabara Bay is now the location of Rio de Janeiro. These settlers were the Huguenots who saw the settlement as an escape valve offering safety outside France. The Portuguese eventually defeated them, and then the French established Fort Caroline on the St. John River in Florida, which is near contemporary Jacksonville. Realizing the French were uncomfortably close to their shipping lanes, the Spanish settled St. Augustine near the fort that they had established earlier, and then they moved against the Huguenot settlement, wiping it out. A third French effort established St. Croix in what is now New England, but it failed. Finally, the French settled in Quebec in 1608. English colonial efforts began slowly. Early colonies failed, and the king's business at home hampered concentration on colonization. Jamestown is the first permanent English settlement in the New World. When it was settled, about 500 young men came to the area on the James River to establish a town. Very few, if any, most likely none, of those young men expected to stay. They lived in hastily built lean-tos or tents, and they expected to go back to England quite soon after finding the gold they heard that lies scattered around on the ground. They would leave the settlement, go into the woods, look for gold, which they never found, then return at night to their settlement because no one knew what lay out in those woods. Might be some horrible monster or something very dangerous. It soon became evident, however, that England did not want those settlers back. So women soon joined them, and the camp became a town. The first building constructed was the church, and then they began to establish themselves as settlers in Jamestown. Once Jamestown became permanent due to the discovery of a viable cash crop, tobacco, movement began upriver. In 1618, the Virginia Company established the headright system, which granted 50 acres to anyone who would farm it. This act gave colonists a stake in the success of the colony, and it began to prosper. Separatist Puritans came to America in 1620 in search of an opportunity to worship without interference from the English Church. Intending to settle in Virginia, their ship was blown off course and they landed in what is now Massachusetts. After exploring the coast for a possible site for their community, the Puritans disembarked at Plymouth Rock. These settlers expected to set up a city on a hill, a community which proved their concept of church and state worked. They believed England would call them home when their efforts proved successful. Ministerial oversight was difficult to come by, however, and the Church of England ultimately sent John Lyford to Massachusetts in 1624. But the Puritans in Plymouth soon found out that he was a wolf in sheep's clothing, and they sent him packing. It was not until 1629 that the Pilgrims founded a minister who proved satisfactory. In 1626, 6 years after the establishment of Plymouth, non-separatist Puritans began settling near Salem, Massachusetts. They were sponsored by the Massachusetts Bay Company. Over a 4-year period, nearly 30,000 Puritans moved to 7 previously designed and platted towns. As the population grew and new towns were established, each new community had to have a charter in hand before they would allow settlement. And the charter demanded a method of land distribution, criteria established for citizenship in the community, and an elected leadership in place, and most importantly, a minister for the community. Events within Massachusetts eventually led to the establishment of Rhode Island and Connecticut. The English supplanted the Dutch in New York, colonies were established in the South, and William Penn was awarded Pennsylvania in payment for debts the crown owed his father. Immigrants to the colonies came mostly from Northern Europe. Among them were Catholics, Baptists, Anabaptists, Lutherans, Quakers, and Moravians. Religious life then deteriorated in the colonies until the middle of the 18th century. A religious revival, the Great Awakening, swept through the colonies, bringing a sense of unity which many historians believe provided the foundation for turning the 13 colonies into a single nation. Any story of the Great Awakening must emphasize the work of great men such as Jonathan Edwards of Massachusetts and George Whitefield, who preached throughout the colonies, and then Samuel Davies in the South. By 1776, the fervor of the Great Awakening died out. At the beginning of the War of the American Revolution, church historian Martin Marty said, "The Great Awakening had turned into the Big Sleep." The unity spawned by the awakening, however, served to unite the colonies, as did a desire for liberty and freedom, and the war which followed formed a new country. I'll have more to say about the freedoms guaranteed in that new nation in my concluding lecture.